2 years ago, I filmed my first video on Yule. I sat in front of my TV that had a fake fireplace on the screen, and I tried to break down Yule traditions, all while wearing my sexy Yule sweater. 1 year ago, I sat on my couch once again and tried to share with you more information on the heathen holidays, all while still wearing this very sexy Yule sweater. And then I also held a gathering in Kentucky with over 50 people where we got to actually practice Yule together. Really, for most of us, it was the first time we had done anything in this kind of group environment. I have learned a lot these last couple of years, and I want to once again tackle the subject of Yule. While I am still wearing this sexy Yule sweater, there is one thing that has changed.
Now I have an actual fireplace. This is not the only thing that has changed in the last couple of years. Like many of you, when I first got into this faith and really started exploring the holidays around it, I was under the misinformation, the misconception that Yule and the winter holidays was the kind of the progenitor of all winter holidays, at least in our modern world. And while this is true for certain traditions, it is not true as a global holiday. In fact, a lot of things that are maybe even Nordic in origin or pagan in origin have taken on new life as they have entered other cultures. But one thing I want to do in this video as well is kind of establish the difference between traditional heathen historical Yule, which we have some information on, and what has been added in the last 100 years, at least to the celebration of Yule today.
First, I do want to cover what we have surviving from the pre-Christian era in Scandinavia. The best account of Yule celebrations come from the saga of Håkon the Good and Heimskringla, which is an account of the Norwegian kings at the time of conversion, written by Snorri Sturluson. I highly recommend picking up a copy of this writing as it contains many great stories I have never heard before. We recently covered several of these stories on the Folk podcast if you want to check them out. Now, this book is well over 700 pages, so what I want to focus on here is a section talking about the actual heathen rituals around this time of year. King Haakon was a good Christian when he came to Norway, but as the whole country was heathen with much heathenish sacrifice, and as there was many great people who had favor over the common people, he resolved to practice his Christianity in private, but he kept Sundays and the Friday fast and some token of the greatest holy days. He made a law that the festival of Yule should begin at the same time as the Christian people held it, and that every man, under penalty, should brew a meal of malt into ale and then keep the Yule holy as long as it lasted. Before him, the beginning of Yule, or the slaughter night, was the night of midwinter, or December 14th, and Yule was kept for 3 days thereafter. It was his intent, as soon as he had set himself fast in the land and had subjugated the whole of his power, to introduce Christianity.
There seems to be a pretty big debate within the broader heathen community on when Yule should be celebrated. Now, the people who believe that it should be celebrated in January, in the midwinter as it is described within this saga, are technically correct. I mean, if you actually look into the history and look in the evidence, Yule was not celebrated near the solstice until after Håkon the Good changed the date. And then also with the intermingling of heathenry and Asatru with Wicca in the last 100 years, the date of December 21st really has become the most known date and the most worshipped on. But technically, historic Yule was something that was done in the midwinter months. And then you also have to look at the fact that the heathens of this time would have followed a different calendar than everybody else. And I did take a poll on YouTube to see when people generally worship and celebrate the Yule season. And out of 862 votes, around 56% of people said that they celebrate near the solstice, whereas only 6% said that they followed it on a historical heathen context as far as within January or the midwinter. And then I did put another option there, which is it doesn't really matter, and that is 38% of the votes. And I would say I honestly fall into this category myself, because I believe if you want to celebrate it in January, that's perfectly fine. And if you want to celebrate it near the winter solstice, I mean, that's what my community does personally. But even then, we have a gathering coming up on the solstice, and then we also have a gathering in January. As long as it takes place in winter, I think that's really all that matters, because this is a winter celebration.
Within this saga, we're also given a good look at what traditions and rituals were conducted during this time of year, at least to historical heathens during the late Viking Age. Sigurd was the greatest of men to provide sacrifices just as his father was, and Sigurd always presided on behalf of the king at all festivals of sacrifice in Trondheim country. It was an old custom that when there was to be sacrifice, all the people should come to the spot where the temple stood and bring with them all that they required while the festival of the sacrifice lasted. To this festival, all the men brought ale with them and all kinds of cattle, as well as horses that were to be slaughtered, and all the blood that came from them was called holot, and the vessels in which it was collected were called holot vessels. Holot staves were made, like sprinkling brushes, with which the whole of the altars in the temple walls, both outside and inside, were sprinkled over, and also the people were sprinkled with the blood. But the flesh was boiled into savory meats for those present. The fire was in the middle of the floor of the temple, and over it hung the kettles. And the full goblets were handed across the fire, and he who made the feast was chief blessed the full goblets, and all the meat of the sacrifice. And first Odin's goblet was emptied for victory and power to his king. Thereafter, Njord's and Freya's goblets for peace and a good season. Then it was the custom of many to empty the Braga goblet, which is a goblet where oaths were sworn onto. And then guests emptied a goblet to the memory of departed friends called the Remembrance Goblet.
There are a few things we can dig into with these two sections, one and the biggest one being the sacrifices given, because sacrifices were a thing in the past. Now, it's not something that's very common nowadays. We tend to just give, I believe it's called votive offerings, which are offerings that are not from the living creatures. You don't actually kill a horse or kill a cow. And I find this is probably more common than anything else right now, just simply because our lives have changed. Most of us don't own any form of livestock, and so this just isn't very practical. But as a community this year, we actually do want to do something that kind of calls back to this. So those holot vessels, or the holot staves, where they actually sprinkled the blood on the participants and within the walls of the temple as well, we do want to kind of do that. So what we've done is actually, I've ordered some iron oxide, which is basically just iron powder, and we're going to mix that with the mead and bless that and use that for it. And it's going to still have a very blood smell to it, kind of look like blood. And so it's a modern way of doing this that I still think honors the tradition of blessing some form of sacred vessel. Now, of course, there's the meat and potatoes of the section. It's the actual mentioning of the offerings given during the Yule celebration, including Odin, Njord, and Freya. Njord is a very interesting one for me because you really don't hear mentionings of Njord very often. And then you also have the ancestral offerings and then the personal oath offerings as well. So I really do think this would be a great blueprint for someone getting into the faith for the first time that's looking to bring something historic to their Yule celebration.
Some other brief passages I want to mention go as follows. The eating of horse flesh at these religious festivals was considered the most direct proof of paganism in the following times, and was punished by death or mutilation by Saint Olaf. It was a ceremony apparently commemorative of their Asiatic origins and ancestors. This winter, AD 1017, Ivan was at the Yule feast of the king and received goodly gifts from him. Brynjolf Ylfalda was also with the king and he received a Yule present from the king of a gold-mounted sword and also a farm called Veteland, which is a very large head farm of the district. Brynjolf then composed a song about these gifts. The song-famed hero to my hand gave a good sword and Veteland.
So these two sections, there's really two things we can kind of look at. One, the horse meat is very interesting because here in the United States, the eating of horse meat is very taboo. It is not technically illegal. However, it is illegal usually to sell horse meat in any capacity in the majority of the states here. Now, me personally, living in Kentucky, the eating of horse meat is not only considered a cultural taboo, but you'll probably be excommunicated out of Kentucky for doing so because horses are so prized here and they're worth absolutely tons of money. And so the eating of horse meat is just like completely out the window here in Kentucky. Now, I will say while I was in Germany, I actually did have some horse sausage. Please don't kick me out of Kentucky. But I had it in Germany and it was something that was offered to me by a Bavarian family and it was pretty good. But it is interesting that this is something that is still practiced in some way. Now, was it considered a sacred thing? Was it a religious thing? No. Now, what I will say, maybe the cultural taboo of eating horse meat in the modern world came from this, from St. Olaf banning it because it was considered a heathen practice. I can't say that 100%, but it is very interesting. The section about the gift giving I added just simply to show that gift giving has been a tradition of the winter holidays for at least 1,000 years and probably much further past that as well, and I think it's really cool to see that. Now, we may not give plots of land and gold-plated swords. I mean, I wouldn't say no to those things, but gift giving has always been an important thing, at least what we can tell from history, for the Yule season as well as winter holidays in general. Now, before we move on to the next section of this video, I do want to share with you one last section from Heimskringla, and that's because it's a very interesting Yule mentioning. Now, keep in mind, this is a fragment of a story, but I wanted to share with you because it is absolutely bizarre and one of the strangest stories I have read from any kind of saga, and it's so brief, but I hope you enjoy this very strange Yule story.
One Yule Eve, the king sat in his hall, and the tables were laid out, and the king said, "Get me flesh meat." They answered, "Sire, this is not the custom to eat flesh meat on Yule Eve." The king said, "If it not be the custom, I will make it the custom." They went out and brought him a dolphin. The king stuck his knife into it, but did not eat it. Then the king said, "Bring me a girl here into the hall." So they brought him a woman whose headdress went far down her brows. The king took her hand in his hand, looked at her, and said, "An ill-looking girl."
What were they going to do with the girl and the dolphin? Was some unsavory things going to happen there? I don't know. I need to know. Was this a common Yule meal? A big old dolphin in the middle of the table? Did he stab it in the blowhole? Where the fuck did they get a dolphin on such short notice? I have questions.
If you would like to help me provide a dolphin feast for my Yule dinner, please think about supporting this channel on Patreon, where you will also gain access to our community Discord, exclusive live streams, and early access videos. And if all you can do is share this dolphin story with others, please make sure you like this video and share it when you can. Thank you for whatever help you're able to provide, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video.
Now, what about the Yule Goat, or the Yule Tree, or maybe even Santa Claus being Odin, or the Christmas tree, Yule Tree? Quite frankly, there's not enough time in one video to really cover all these things, but I'll kind of cover them briefly because some, yes, are pagan in origin, while others might be pagan in origin, but have shared commonalities with so many different cultures around the world. It's really impossible and probably just not necessary to claim these things of having pagan origin because it doesn't really do anyone good. These are world traditions at this point. Now, the one that is probably irrefutably pagan in origin is definitely the Yule Goats, because this is something that is still practiced very heavily in the Scandinavian and Nordic countries today. I mean, there's whole festivals built around these things. I saw a picture online of like a 40-foot tall Yule Goat. Now, there really isn't one concrete truth on where these came from, but the most commonly accepted theory is that they represent Thor's goats because they can be burned and brought back as long as their bones are, fused together, so maybe it represents that. But regardless, the Yule Goat is a very Nordic tradition that has been carried over around the world, just not to the extent of the others. The Yule log is a really great example of something that was most likely pagan, but has taken on a whole new life as it has traveled across the planet. From what I could tell, traditionally and historically within the Nordic countries, they would feed a massive tree through the fireplace, and it would burn over 12 days. So as it would burn, they would actually shove more of it into the fireplace, which sounds completely impractical. So as humans have evolved and society and cultures have changed, Yule logs have definitely moved away from the tree just being fed into the fire and have moved to usually one really densely made log that is then burned, and I think they typically do last 12 days is the goal. And then the French, for some reason, decided to turn the dang thing into a cake. And that's how I knew it. That's what I thought a Yule log was when I first got into this. I was like, the cake? Do we put the cake in the fire? But apparently that was the French's fault. And then we have the Christmas tree or the Yule tree, which is something I talked about in my first video. Again, that's what I was kind of referencing in the very beginning, is I did say some things because that's what I believed back then, is that Christmas trees were possibly from pagan in origin. And while they still could be, Christmas trees are such a universal human thing at this point, it's really impossible to pinpoint exactly where they came from. I mean, most likely is somewhere from Northern Europe or European, but Christmas trees have been adopted by so many cultures around the world and really stand as a symbol for the winter season that I really think it is a disservice to say, one way or another where they came from. This has become a human tradition, and we should be proud of that if that's where it came from. If it came from the Nordic countries, we should just be proud of that and not steal any form of ownership of where they came from. Just enjoy the celebration and the tradition. Now, Santa Claus, I know Jackson Crawford has already made an entire video on Santa Claus and Odin, I believe. Now, I've never really thought that Odin was Santa Claus. I've heard the stories, where they've kind of shape-shifted and changed. While I was in Germany, I heard stories of Odin being Santa Claus, and he definitely takes that place at times, but I don't know if it's necessarily the origin. But do I think it's wrong to, teach your children like, oh yes, Odin is Santa Claus? No. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with, saying that Odin could be Father Christmas. Just saying it irrefutably, one is the other, I think is where we start running into problems. Historically, we do see that Odin is a deity that was venerated during this time, and he does have the name of Yulnir as one of his names. So Odin being a principal figure with a long white beard during this time of year, it's easy to see why the connection with Odin comes together, and I really have no problem with it. Again, I just don't think it's fair for us to say 100%, it's Odin and, that's ours. Even the 12 nights of Yule, which seems to be a very common practice among many people, as many people commented on that poll I did, saying that they practice Yule for 12 nights starting on the solstice, which I think is a really great tradition. But I couldn't find in my research that the 12 nights of Yule were the first 12 nights of a winter holiday, because obviously you have the 12 nights of Christmas, which is a very Christian tradition at this point, and there's many different aspects of this multiple day cycle. I mean, ranging from 1 day to 25 days to a whole month. You know, the Christmas tradition, the Yule tradition, the winter tradition seems to take place over several days, whether you think that's 1, 3, 12, or more than that. And if you look into the saga of Håkon the Good, you'll see that he mentions that the Yule season is 3 days, that it should be kept sacred. So, you know, there doesn't seem to be any concrete answer for how long you should celebrate Yule. Just enjoy the season, but definitely take some time for yourself and your family in this modern, crazy busy world, where if they could, they would completely take all your days off from the holiday season.
Another factor I want to bring up to help peel back the many layers of the Yule season is that Wicca has had a huge influence over how modern heathens celebrate this holiday, as the Wiccan winter Sabbath is also called Yule, and oftentimes the traditions listed are very rarely based on the heathen perspective. So really, we have two events called Yule during this time of year. A great example of this comes from a recent purchase I made for the holiday season. It is simply called The Little Book of Yule by Jason Mankey. And while it's an adorable little book and looks great on the shelf, I was very disappointed to find that it only contains 5 pages of 222 that feature any reference to the actual heathen Yule. Almost every other page contains some other understanding or cultural tradition that have all been adopted by Wiccan practitioners during this time of year. While I don't have a problem with people celebrating in their own way, this can make the process of finding information on actual heathen Yule very difficult, as Wicca is dramatically more popular than the modern Norse pagan/heathen revival. And I will say there are many rituals that I believe come from this that even our community has adopted as well, such as a Sunablot or a Soul Day, where you stay up all night to honor the return of the longer days ahead. This is a really great activity that really pushes people to their limits, is a lot of fun, and encourages activities like board games or even just a really deep conversation to make it through the long night. I have seen no historical evidence to back this up, and I can assume this is something that was created in the last 50 years, and that is perfectly okay. In Matthias Nordvig's book on Ostertrue, I think he puts a really good bow on top of the conversation of Yule. He says that many modern heathens have adopted customs and traditions that do not come from the pre-Christian customs, but were invented in the span of the last 500 years, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Alright, that covers a large majority of the historical information and the transition period to our modern era. Really, all that's left is for me to describe how I believe you can celebrate this time of year, and I'm really trying to stay away from the term should celebrate, because if you can't tell from this video already, there is no one way to do this, so I just want to share with you ways that you can celebrate this time of year.
As a solo practitioner, your Yule celebrations can vary drastically based on an infinite amount of factors. I do highly recommend decorating in some way. To me, there is nothing wrong with a Yule tree, a wreath, or some classic Christmas decorations like stockings or even a Santa Claus or two. Maybe you should skip the nativity scene though. As far as what rituals to perform, I do think connecting to the historical rituals and traditions that we know from the past is a really great starting point, such as an offering to Odin, then to Njord and Freya, and then finally to the ancestors as well. I will say it is up to you whether or not you want to eat the ritual horse meat though. I also believe the Sunablot or Soul Day would be a really great solo goal, as it can be hard to keep oneself busy all throughout the night, and finding activities to do during this long night would be a really great mini marathon for yourself to greet the new year. I know many of you out there are not in situations that would allow you to practice your faith as openly as you would like during this time of year. However, I do believe the winter holidays are the best time of year to show your more pagan-y side, even to your family, simply because many of the traditions are either pagan in origin or so similar that you should have no shame in celebrating them with your non-pagan friends and family. So don't be afraid to get into the spirit of the season with gift giving, being thankful, and enjoying your friends and family. One suggestion I've been making to people in non-pagan environments is to bring your departed family members up in a celebratory way. For instance, at my Thanksgiving this year, which was not in a pagan environment, I gave an offering to the ancestors in a form of a small plate that was left aside and later burned, and all the non-pagan people in attendance absolutely loved it and even mentioned bringing it into their own lives. I think this is a really great way to share the really beautiful parts of a pagan practice in a way that is not intrusive to others' beliefs. While I completely understand those who prefer to celebrate alone during this time of year, or the ones who do not have a community to celebrate with, I have to admit that Yule is best celebrated with others. This is also backed up by the historical celebrations. This was a large feast that would involve people from all around feasting and drinking together. So to celebrate in the same way now is an amazing experience. Even the name Yule was historically used as a term for drinking. This is my second season with the community started around this channel, and it appears that the Yule gatherings will continue to be the largest gatherings we have every year. It also seems that these gatherings will also bring on the most magic and the individual rituals performed as well. Our gathering last year was large, loud, and amazing all at the same time. It had the most people, the largest feast, and well, a stripper pole too.
Never again.
The first night we did perform a Suna Bloat, where I called the gods and ancestors and spirits to join us for the weekend, and then we committed ourselves to making it through the long night to greet the new dawn, and about half of us made it. The next day, we had both a Mother's Night ritual, which has become a very popular heathen tradition around Yule, which involves honoring the Disir, which are female ancestor spirits that guide us throughout our lives. And then we had an Odin ritual right afterwards on the shores of a lake during a meteor shower. The final day featured a ritual to the Vanir for the coming harvest, and finally a ritual in which people gave offerings for success in the coming year. And of course, there was an insane amount of food, great feast, and lots of drinking.
Too much drinking.
It was an amazing experience, and as we come into this next weekend, our Yule season begins in Ohio with an even larger gathering, a bigger space, and hopefully even more amazing memories.
There is no one right way to celebrate Yule, and that is perfectly okay. Everyone's practices and traditions for this time of year are going to look different. But like with many things in our modern world, especially in heathenry and Norse paganism, I don't think we should focus too much on the differences of our practice, but instead come together with what we do very similarly. And even more so with this time of year and the winter celebrations, because this is something that brings us together not only as pagans, but something that brings us together as a species, as many humans, the majority of humans, come together for the winter months to celebrate and be thankful for what we have, to enjoy our times with our friends and family, and yes, drink and feast and be merry. 2 years ago, I was alone in front of a digital fire celebrating the old gods by myself. 1 year ago, I was able to do it with 50 of my brothers and sisters, and this year I will be able to do it with over 70 of my friends and family in this community. So much can happen in such a short span of time, and I am beyond thankful for all that has happened with the Wisdom of Odin and its community. And I have no doubt that one day we will have a hall so that we can all come together and drink with one another. But until that day, I want to wish every single one of you a good Yule and a wonderful and bountiful new